Spread the fire, welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm joined by Tasneem Essop, who's a brilliant political analyst and is also a researcher at the Society, Work and Politics Institute at WITS. I always enjoy her political analysis, and I bring you the freshest insights here on SMWX. So, Tasneem, thanks so much for joining us on this episode.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Finally, we got it together, so that's good.
Yeah, I've been trying to get you on SMWX for about 3 years, so here we go. So, Tasneem, I think the big thing that's coming up this week is President Cyril Ramaphosa will be testifying at the State Capture Commission in his capacity as ANC president the week or a few weeks after he's testifying as president of the country. But I'm quite interested to know what you're expecting from this and what kind of things you're hoping what kind of questions you're hoping that the president answers.
Yeah, so I mean, despite my misgivings about the commission and commissions in South Africa in general, which is perhaps a conversation for another day, I will comment a little bit on this. But yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about this question, I thought about how I've been avoiding talking about the Zondo Commission into state capture for some time, and really my difficulty with thinking about the commission. And this comes down to, for me, what accountability looks like, what justice looks like, and what the value is in laying all of this out in public, for us to have public conversations about it, really. But yeah, still keeping in mind, accountability and justice. So I'm really concerned about those things, but also, whether talking about corruption at this national level kind of distracts us from also looking at corruption at local levels, which I think is really important for us to continue pressing on, having conversations about. And of course, communities are constantly raising this problem of local level corruption. But anyways, those are my general things about the commission and my difficulty really with talking about the commission, despite how important it is. And I will affirm that it is an important process that we're going through as a country with this commission. So, I mean, Ramaphosa will be testifying in two capacities, but I'll just speak to both of them because I think they really are linked, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we need to reassert in this moment something that's really obvious, which is that Ramaphosa was the deputy president in the Zuma administration, was the deputy president of the ANC for many years, while Zuma was president. And this is important to reassert because going into the Nasrec conference and coming out of that conference with all of the kind of political changes that have happened, Ramaphosa emerges as this anti-corruption person and really constructs this story behind it, right? So it's linked to the New Dawn and to Mamina and all of that, but he really does stand in that period going to Nasrec as this anti-corruption person. But he was deputizing for so long while all of this was going on, right? So we've heard President Ramaphosa say many times how he's been shocked at this state of affairs, at corruption and a number of other things. And shocked really in a period where he was a senior leader in government and a senior leader in the ANC. And for me, this is just frankly nonsense, right? So I think what this testimony gives us is an opportunity for a bit of accountability for his role during those years, right? This idea of being shocked, I hope, will not fly when it comes down to testifying at the commission. And the way in which he's distanced himself from the Zuma years, will hopefully be uncovered a little bit. But that's also something for us to reflect on as people who think about, comment on, are involved in politics and just in general, how we've let this story fly, right? This distance,
totally.
this short idea fly, and really that's a reflection on us and the media and whatever else. Just in general, the South African public needs to reflect on this, how we've constructed Ramaphosa's rise to power, right? So I think it's well it's been repeated many times, well critiqued, and it's worthy of repeating again. That as Ramaphosa goes into this moment of testifying at the State Capture Commission, that we really need to remind ourselves to disabuse ourselves of this Messiah villains story, because that's going to allow us to accurately reflect on on what he says during this period, but also how we understand that. So, I mean, I think given all of that, a lot of his testimony should focus on his role in those years in the ANC and in government, right? And I expect that the hard questions should be around this, and he shouldn't get away with how we've allowed this period to be constructed. And then other questions, I think, will come up around his relationship with the Gupta family, what was happening in state-owned enterprises. And then I expect a lot to be around internal politics in the ANC and policies of the ANC, and then the relationship between the ANC and private entities. And then I think this has bigger ramifications for President Ramaphosa in terms of, the contestations around what happened leading into the NASREC conference and financing of conferences and so on. But the last thing I want to say about this is that I think we should bear in mind that given the kind of critique of commissions that we can put forward, is that commissions can be used as a political tool. We've seen others use commissions as a political tool, and there might be an attempt here to use this position in the commission, or going to the commission to speak, to bolster, one's political position. And I don't think, Ramaphosa will necessarily not do that. So I think let's just keep in mind the politics of the commission, and how, someone like a president could position themselves to come out better or worse out of a testimony that could be quite rough, or should be quite rough for him.
That's really interesting. So much of what you say, I think we need to be very careful as we go into this. I can already see the Ramaphosa Defense Force is like out in full on the media everywhere, just like already defending him before he's even testified. And so I think there's going to be a big push to kind of consolidate this narrative that, Ramaphosa represents all that's good and pure in the ANC, and setting up this dichotomy where you have to choose the lesser of two evils. But on the other hand, you also don't want to yourself fall into like a factional pattern where you criticize Ramaphosa and then people use that and use your voice to now try and defend Zuma and Magashule. So it's kind of hard to, in this moment where things are so loud and so noisy and so polarized, it's kind of hard to find a space in the country where people like sanity prevails, and people are like, what if we just criticize the president on the basis of like objective standards for ethical behavior in public office?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, even at NASREC, which was sort of my first, well, not my first, but first big like political commentary thing, I felt that kind of pressure, right? It's like, how do you toe this line between being critical, and I was very critical of Ramaphosa going into that. And I guess it's one of the few times in my life I can call a bit of consistency in terms of like just criticism of, this, well, Ramaphosa going into NASREC, but also this whole New Dawn stuff. But I mean, the point is that it's very, very difficult for us to toe that line, but we have to have moral integrity and honesty about our politics, right? And I think if we do that, we can stay above this like kind of factional stuff, because I mean, it becomes obvious that you're going to criticize a lot of different factions and parts of this. But of course it is used, and it's used and manipulated, and the way we critique Ramaphosa is ammunition to other factions. But I really think we need to question this like better of two devils thing, right?
Please.
And yeah, as you say, it's very difficult because we are put in a situation where it feels like you're between a rock and a hard place, right? But my thing is that what you can do is through your criticism put pressure on what we have now, which is a Ramaphosa-led ANC and a Ramaphosa-led government to do better. And that is where, you know, my sort of criticism is aimed, right? It's not at like this getting involved in this factional stuff, but it is about saying that these are the problems with this administration, right? And we can talk about a lot. I mean, there's austerity, there's corruption, there's all sorts of things. And what we're saying is that there is an opportunity to do better, to do different, and to reinvent, right? And I think that's important, that it's not criticism for the sake of pulling down one faction here. And that we can assert that, yes, in some ways things have been positive for the ANC or positive for the country. But we have all of these other criticisms and problems. And perhaps that's something for us to hold on to, bearing in mind our need to have honesty and to speak clearly about South African politics.
Well, that kind of takes us into a conversation that's become a theme on this channel, almost organically, which is about what are the alternatives to the status quo as we find it, particularly for our generation. And the thing for me, I don't know, I just want to float this by you to start this conversation, but you know, just feel free to say whatever you feel about this question of what do we do, right? And what does something different really look like? So I think a common assumption is that this perfect alternative is going to emerge while the ANC is still dominant. And so people's assumption is that the timeline is a perfect alternative emerges and then the ANC falls, basically. But I'm increasingly starting to think that, like, you need the conditions for an alternative to actually emerge, and part of those one of those conditions is an opportunity to actually, you know, govern or feel like you might be able to gain power. So I'm starting to wonder whether you first need the ANC to actually fall before an alternative can actually present itself. And that's, for me, why it's so important to keep the criticism up, because I think a lot of people are like, if we criticize, then the ANC falls, and then what comes in its place? And of course, the danger is that, you know, something equally bad comes in its place. But the opportunity is when the ANC falls, suddenly a gap opens and alternatives can actually potentially materialize. So yeah, that's just one assumption that I think does need to be challenged in this whole question of where alternatives come from.
Sure. So I'm not sure about this. I think there is the potential that we find ourselves in a very dangerous situation, and that there is a pressing need to organize, to mobilize, and to begin to establish political alternatives. And I'll get into this because if the moment does come, and it's a big if, because I am a strong believer, looking at the ANC's history, in its ability to constantly reinvent itself over time. And I think the ANC has done this in the darkest periods of its history. But of course, now we're in a different situation. I mean, the ANC is a governing party, no longer a liberation movement, and so on. But I think if you take seriously, like, the history of the ANC, you have to agree with that idea that it is able to reinvent itself, or not reinvent itself. It doesn't emerge as something new, but to re-energize itself, to place itself at the center of South African politics again and again and again. So, I mean, this is a big, right? If the ANC falls, I do think we will need different forms, whatever form that takes, but the alternatives will need to be there, or the alternative thinking will need to be there at very minimum. But I don't want to take away from the fact that organization is important, right? So yeah, let's hang on to that a little bit. And I mean, the worry here for me is if we look at political alternatives broadly, the rise of the right internationally, but also the rise of the right in South Africa and the new right in South Africa is important for us to keep an eye on, right? We don't want a situation where the ANC falls if that happens, and a type of politics that we really don't want comes to replace that, right? And I think in the world that we are in at the moment, where we lack so much credible political options, alternatives, thinking at a mass scale, that becomes a concern for me, right? And that's why I go back to the need for us to engage in actual politics, right? And then, I mean, there's a whole lot of questions for me, like when I think about political alternatives. It's something that we talk about a lot now, right? And I want us to bear in mind the various levels at which we talk about political alternatives. There's alternatives at the level of the state, there's alternatives at the level of government, and then there's alternatives outside of the state or away from the state, right? And the reason I mention this is because I don't want us to just think about political alternatives in the political party format or as electoral choices. But I want us to think about alternative forms of politics and alternative politics that doesn't just have to be in the form of a political party necessarily, right? Not that that isn't a good idea, but it doesn't have to be. And we should think about these various levels at which politics happens, right? So, I mean, the reason I also say this is because if you look at South African electoral politics at a glance, we have many parties that contest, parties at various ends of the political spectrum. We have options on many sides, right? But these are not winning options. And when I say winning options, I don't even mean options that are going to govern. I mean just options that are able to get a share of the vote that is, that becomes a credible electoral alternative. So I think we need to question why those aren't winning options. And I mean, we can do a deep dive on many of these sort of political parties. But I think it does open us up to a conversation about broader politics and forms of politics. Let me put it this way, and not just going into parties. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at those. I mean, well, the first thing I'm interested in is your distinction between political alternatives and alternative political visions, which may be linked, but it does feel like we actually haven't yet done the work of really rethinking what this country could be. It feels like everything's operating in a very narrow band of consensus, and the hard work of really like actually painting a future that is feasible and practical hasn't actually yet been done, I don't think.
Yeah, look, it hasn't, and I think that's exactly it. Is that it's hard work, right? And it's the hard work of reimagining politics, right? It's about reimagining our political imagination, and I think for so long this has been dominated by the ANC, and it's been dominated by a particular history of needing to break out of apartheid, and I think that has really set up for for the period of democracy what our political imagination looks like. So for me, that hard work of alternative visions, of alternative politics comes from that, right? So the ANC kind of looms over us, right? It's a sort of mammoth thing. And I think if we want to start talking about practical political alternatives or alternatives at the level of imagination, we have to understand that there's a distinction here between the ANC, the organization that we currently see, and the ANC, the idea of the ANC. The idea of the ANC is more important for me. That's about like history, tradition, myth making, all of this rhetoric that comes when we think as a country about the the history of that organization and the role that the hegemonic role that it's come to play, right? So, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on history, but that tradition comes to dominate our political imagination. So we do need to think about it and perhaps dispense with it. So we're in a situation now where people are disgruntled with the ANC, the current organization, but I'm not convinced that there's yet a shift enough away from the idea of the ANC. I mean, we see this in electoral seasons, right? That people would rather sit at home than not vote for the ANC, would rather not vote than not vote for the ANC. And I do believe that many of the reasons for not voting are political reasons. And I think that is one of them, right? And it's not, like, I think there's this kind of idea that, you know, people are silly to do this, or you know, it's a lack of political maturity or whatever is said out there in the media when this kind of thing gets raised. But I think we do need to take it seriously. And I think we need to question that idea and the centrality that it holds in our political culture and in our politics. So, I mean, I think, we always come back to that, right? The role of the ANC and how we look beyond it, how we look for political alternatives and what those alternatives would look like. And this is something that I, of course, don't have an answer on. And I think it is really hard work. This is going to be really hard work.
Yeah, the hard thing as well is that even if South African politics is reconfigured, both at the level of political imagination, but also formal politics and even outside of formal politics, it's not like the forces that currently make up what we call the ANC are going anywhere. They may themselves be reconfigured and form part of new configurations. So the one hard question, I suppose, is to what extent does one accommodate and embrace, you know, people who have formed part of the problem in the first place, and to what extent does one, you know, just try to discard the entire thing for what it's done to us, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting also, because the ANC births many political alternatives, right? I mean, the EFF is one of these. It comes out of the ANC. It's a child of Congress in many ways. And so, and I mean, we've taken the EFF seriously, or many of us have. I have taken the EFF seriously to really try and understand what role it plays. And I think we're going to have to do that more. There's many who anticipate more breakaways from the ANC and so on. And that is something we have to question. But for me, it is a problem when we take when we have new things, new organizations, new political parties that emerge, but they keep the forms of politics that come from the ANC. And I think that's, you know, maybe it's not just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's just think about that, you know.
Yeah, I'm scared to touch on the EFF because of all that it represents. But well, you've gone there, so. but you know what? I think what you say is quite important, because I think that on the progressive side of the spectrum, there's still been a tendency to just dismiss the EFF and oversimplify the EFF and not take it seriously, as you say. And while the EFF probably doesn't represent the perfect alternative, certainly to a lot of voters, I'm not so sure that we can just, you know, get by with saying, well, this is just a disaster and all of that. Like, I think there is something in the EFF that needs to be taken a lot more seriously than it has been, even by people who you would expect to take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is one of the things that sort of irritated me early on with with the analysis of the EFF, right, is this really simplistic sort of dismissal of the EFF. And it is, yeah, so I mean, there were all of these ideas. The EFF is fascist, it's populist, it's, it's racial populism. And I feel a lot of progressives sort of just dismissed it, as you're saying, right? But what for me is important is why the EFF managed to gain a foothold in South African politics, right, and what they represented. And certainly from their public position, they represented a new left, a new left alternative to the left of the ANC, that is. And I think that obviously had appeal, right? They were dealing with social issues, racism, economic issues, a different way of organizing the economy, a different way of organizing society, right? That's what the EFF initially was speaking to, right? And the fact that that managed to gain some ground is important for us not to dismiss. It was important for me not to dismiss from the get-go, but also the way it organizes its politics, the way it practically does politics, and the way we look at its politics, its style of doing politics and its mechanisms of doing politics, right? So there are a lot of things to consider in terms of how the EFF becomes a really important political voice in South Africa, right? For a party that in the beginning got, 6 point something percent, and is now like around 10%, the kind of position that they have in terms of talking about South African politics is really, really important, right? So I don't want to dismiss that. And I do want us to take seriously what makes it important. But at the same time, since they've been established, there's been a whole lot of things that have really bolstered the criticisms against the EFF. And I think a lot of these have become really genuine concerns and criticisms of the EFF. I mean, I think one of the guests you have frequently, Gogo Machikri, on the show speaks about a suspicion with the EFF. Sorry if I'm not paraphrasing correctly, but just around whether the EFF is telling the truth. And I think that was a concern, a knee-jerk concern for a lot of people when the EFF started. And then there was a defense of that, right? But let's look at their policies, let's look at their positions, let's look at what they're advocating for. And those were really, a lot of them were really genuine, and for a lot of people, they were meaningful, right? They were presenting a meaningful critique of South African society, and they still do. But there has been, a whole lot of stuff that's come out that has allowed for this furthering of criticism that is far beyond, I think, this really simplistic dismissal that we talk about. So we must also consider those critiques, but also what the EFF represents. And I've always struggled with this. Does the EFF represent a truly genuine left alternative? Is it sort of straddling a line and really is going to give us a right or center outcome? And I guess for a lot of this, we have to see, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We'll come to it, but the EFF doesn't govern. But yeah, I mean, it's criticism that we can do and that is valid and that we should do. But let's also take what it means for us seriously.
No, definitely. And I think that's just overall a good thing for this conversation about alternatives, because just like the ANC, the EFF is not going anywhere. It may evolve, morph, but that political group and that political bloc is looks like it's here to stay for quite some time. And for me, the thing is that the definitive statements and the simplifications actually are just intellectually uninteresting. Like there's so much interesting happening in that formation, so much ambiguity, like you say, and instead of exploring that ambiguity, people are just too quick to draw these massive deductions and groundless conclusions, in my view. But yeah, that's quite a refreshing thing to hear, I have to say.
I mean, you also spoke earlier about looking for perfect solutions or perfect alternatives, and I think the EFF is an ideal example of how alternatives aren't perfect. And they are, there's so much nuance in when we discuss the EFF.
So let's come back to this final question that we wanted to cover, which is about the local government elections. So President Ramaphosa announced the date, the 27th of October. I must say, I have some serious misgivings just about this election. I'm looking at India, for example, where this massive COVID wave has coincided with an election and all the incentives for public gatherings. I'm seeing parties hosting events. I'm just dreading like mass rallies, which could happen. And I don't know if we've thought through what could happen if we have a wave that coincides with an election. So yeah, I'm just putting that out there, and then we'll see where this conversation goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just uncertain, right? It's a lot of uncertainty, which I think we've been sitting with since the sort of start of this pandemic. Is like, yeah, can we really plan for October? Do we know what's going to happen? And now we have a date that we have to work towards, but there's obviously concerns about waves of COVID, different variants of COVID. And I mean, of course, our vaccination rollout is slow. We might have wanted to be in a different position come October to have these elections, but we aren't, right? And we aren't going to be. So I mean, I have a lot of questions about how this election is going to happen. I mean, probably similar to yours. I mean, the first step is that the IEC is going to have to tell us how elections are going to be run. What are the protocols that are going to be put in place? I mean, look, there have been countries that have had elections during the pandemic, and there are different sort of experiments with how you do that. I'm not sure South Africa is in a position to really make big shifts in terms of our voting process, and that's not going to happen. So we will have to see from the IEC, you know, what are the protocols, and I look forward to sort of hearing that. And then, of course, there's this thing of like generally declining voter turnout. And I mean, I said earlier that I think low voter turnout is a political issue, primarily. It's a political choice, where many say it's an administrative sort of other issues come into it, into not voting. And yes, I mean, those are there, but I do think it's primarily a political issue. But of course, this year, you know, I might have to step back from that position a little bit, because we do have the pandemic, and like, will people go out to vote and so on? And I'm also concerned about the level of responsibility that political parties take on, right?
Yeah.
The traditional methods of campaigning in South Africa are physical, they're face-to-face, they're upfront, and very exciting. But I mean, of course, like, this is a different year, right? I mean, I'm thinking about door-to-door campaigns and politicians crisscrossing the country and party volunteers crisscrossing the country. I'm thinking about Sianqoba rallies and EFF rallies and these large sort of public gatherings. And a lot of that, I guess, won't be allowed to happen, right? Which then has implications on the politics of the elections, and on how voting will unfold and where people will cast their votes. I mean, I think there's a lot to just think about. And then, of course, parties like the DA have for a number of years experimented with different forms of campaigning, because they haven't done those what I called traditional methods of campaigning. So, I mean, there's a lot of jokes every election about being harassed by the DA on your phone. And so, but I mean, those have had mixed results, right? For parties that have chosen to go into those telemarketing and online social media communication and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of how parties reach voters and how they change the minds of voters, because that is ultimately what a lot of parties are trying to do before elections. You know, then there's a whole lot of political questions around the elections, which I guess we can get into. But I think I just come back to this uncertainty, and I think we will have to see how it goes, right? The IEC will have to put in place its protocols. The parties will have to commit to responsible campaigning in a pandemic. And then, you know, we have to see. But I do suspect that as we get closer to elections and as elections heat up, that this, and probably for worse, you know, this question of the pandemic is going to go into the background a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Because they are high stakes.
What are some of the political questions that you alluded to that you think we should bear in mind?
Well, I mean, it's just a general, like, sort of local government elections overview, thinking about that, right? So, I mean, there's been by-elections, and I think, many people have been looking to the by-elections as a sort of precursor to the local government elections because they're happening so close. We had what do they call it, Super Wednesday by-elections that happened at the end of last year also. I don't want to read too much into that, right? I mean, it looks like the ANC has actually fared pretty well in those by-elections, but as I said, I don't think we should read too much into it. By-elections have a very different spin on it, and the sort of national issues are toned down during sessions of by-elections. Whereas when it comes to an actual local government election where everyone goes out to vote, that's just turned right up, right? And if you look at 2016, I think a lot of people said, this 2016 election in especially the metropolitan areas was a referendum on the Jacob Zuma presidency, right? So I'm wondering what's going to nationally characterize this election, or what's going to predominate the conversation this election. And then of course, in those metropolitan areas, there's just so much to think about, right? 2016 seemed like a watershed moment in electoral politics.
Yeah.
But a lot of those coalitions have imploded, and I wonder how voters are going to react to that. I mean, the ANC is back in power in a lot of those municipalities, and there's been just a whole lot of things that have happened since 2016 around these coalitions. And I think there will be questions for voters around how coalitions work and how they become stable and how they function. And this will go into those bigger national questions. So there's a lot to watch very keenly in terms of the metropolitan areas and those coalitions, and where the parties really stand at the moment, right? So I mean, what happened in 2016, I wonder if it's going to happen again, because the DA was the biggest, had the most benefit coming out of 2016. But really, they seem to have given up on national ambitions or ambitions to govern. They really do seem to be serving their narrow political agenda. And so, those voters, those swing voters that really changed the game in 2016, I wonder if there will be an appetite to vote for the DA, for example. And if not, then who benefits from that, right? So there's just a lot to sort of unpack in terms of, where we're going to stand after the 27th, and of course where our COVID numbers will stand, I guess, as part of that.
What I'm worried about is I think that the New Dawn onslaught has basically bought the ANC an extra life. And I feel like it was on the precipice of actually falling, like in 2016 and in the build up to Nasrec. And then suddenly, almost out of nowhere, it has rescued itself, and undeservedly, in my view. But Ramaphosa, along with the way he's been framed, has put reasonable doubt in people's minds about whether the ANC might actually recover, which I think is totally implausible, but it seems to have stuck. So for me, what I worry about with the DAs just DAing, and this New Dawn hope is that the ANC is going to buy itself undeserved time. Certainly in places where it might have lost. I don't know if that's going to happen in the actual areas like Joburg, Tshwane. I think eThekwini is going to be really interesting. I actually think it could lose power in eThekwini, but I don't think it's going to lose as much power as it deserves to lose, basically, because of the weirdness of the last few years.
So just eThekwini, I think, is going to be very, very interesting, and just one for everyone to keep an eye on. You are completely right. It's definitely undeserved. And when we look at a local government election, that is just, it's completely obvious, right?
Yeah.
What has happened at local government level, that people should vote the same party into power again. And I think we often get caught up in the national conversation and we don't focus on those local sort of issues. But as I said earlier, there is going to be a point at which the national mood comes to dominate this local government election. And that is a problem. And I think we should press on local issues and on what's happening in certain, key local areas, but really across the country, to really understand, what that relationship is between the record of governance and voting for the party. So I think it is undeserved, as you're saying. Just want to agree with that. I think so there was this whole idea in the last national election that Ramaphosa sort of saved the ANC from failure in elections, and this even came from within the party. I think I remember. I think it was, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. I think it was Fikile Mbalula who made this claim that Ramaphosa basically saved the ANC from defeat. And I was very wary of this, right? And it sounds repetitive, but I go back to this idea of the ANC, right? And I wonder if one man can save the image of the ANC, or the idea of the ANC, or embody that even. So I'm a bit skeptical about that. And I also wondered to whom we're speaking to when we talk about the importance of the new dawn, right? And it's important that we don't just sort of speak to ourselves, or that the chattering classes come to dominate a conversation about how important that new dawn is. So I'm critical of the idea that Ramaphosa has saved the ANC from certain defeat, and I think there are just so many reasons for this, right? But I will give this, and I will concede that certainly this idea of renewal has become important, right? So I maybe don't think it's the most important thing, but I do think it's maybe extended a bit the potential for the ANC to renew itself. And as I said earlier, I'm not one to cast off the ANC quickly, and I hold on to that. So yeah, it's a bit of both here. So yeah, there is a bit of extension there, but I think we must look beyond that to what, why really people still vote for the ANC, and I'm not sure Ramaphosa is really the key to that. And we need to speak to people, to voters, more regularly.
Well, Tasneem, thank you for joining us on SMWX for your first appearance. But comment down below if you think it shouldn't be her last. And also tweet Tasneem. We're going to put her Twitter handle. So yeah, just ask her to come back, because I found that's the best way to get people back. Just the Twitter following just does the trick. But Tasneem, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to chat to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was a really interesting conversation and set of questions to think about. So yeah, hopefully we'll be back.
Aye.